Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at our webinar this evening. We are talking about state schools, public institutions, the ins and outs of not only the data of the last 30 or so years, but also some of the nuances of the application process as it relates to these schools and looking more closely at those things. And so thank you again for joining us. We're going to give people a few moments just to come into the room. I see people moving on in, so we're going to wait just a couple of moments and then we'll get started. All right, I think people are still coming in, but I think that we're mostly here. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. As I mentioned, we're talking state schools, public universities, and I'm Bari Norman, the head counselor at Expert Admissions, and tonight I'm joined by my colleague Trish Fairweather Cody, who is a senior counselor at Expert Admissions. So again, thank you for joining us. A couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions, we're happy to look at them live. Please put them in the Q&A feature, not the chat. It's easier for us to keep track of them that way. And we'll do our best to incorporate the questions or get to them at the end as best we can. But let's get started and talk a little bit at first, actually. Why are we talking about state schools in the first place on their own? So with state schools, we have a couple of things to take into consideration that we don't have to consider for private institutions. One, we have in-state versus out-of-state, and two, we're thinking about not only sort of the differentiation between the schools, which can be harder for larger schools. Students might say, I want a big rah-rah school experience. I want a cool college town. I want a big school. I want the energy. But differentiating between them can be difficult when building a list. And so having a better handle on the admissions landscape is helpful. And then also, you're going to see as we get later in the slides, it really matters a lot, not just what school you're applying to, but what your interests are and what school or program within the college you're applying to. So we're going to take a deeper look at all of those things. Okay, so let's start with the presentation, and we're going to take a look at first here at the 30-year kind of view. Mom and dad out there, we're going to take you back. So many parents say to us that they understand that things have gotten more competitive and more difficult over the course of the years, certainly since they applied. But we always feel it's helpful to really show the numbers so people can understand just how much it's changed over time. And we feel it's best shown to look at the time period when people who have college-going kids now, around when they applied, which is about 30 years ago. And so we're going to take a look back first at application numbers. And as you can see from the title of the slide, buckle up. We've got here going from the class of 1996 up to the class of 2026. So for class of 1996, excuse me, that's a high school graduating class of 1992. So if you're a year older than I am and we're graduating high school in 1992, this is your application year. The classes that we're showing up at the top are the college graduation years. But what you can see here, and we've got a sampling of schools. And another thing I should mention, you would think that the data for public institutions would be more easily available than those for private schools. It was at least my assumption that it would be, in the sense that you either have to report it for public reporting purposes, or because a lot of these colleges are governed in some way by the state legislature, that this stuff would have to be out there. But this is like top secret stuff that we really don't seem to give away very easily. The numbers that you're going to see tonight throughout the webinar are taken from a PhD level deep dive into data from every possible type of source. It comes from individual conversations that we've had recently with admissions officers, from sessions we've attended at professional conferences also recently. So you're going to see some schools represented, sometimes others other times, and it just has to do with just the difficulty of actually getting this data. And we're so excited to include Wisconsin because this is like hot off the press, literally from yesterday. They've released it finally for last year's data. So just to give you a little bit of a preview that you're going to see certain schools here and not others at different times. But what we're looking at here is a group of schools where if you look at this grid, you can see pretty much there's just the straight shoot up, right? So from college graduating class of 1996 up to class of 2026, you're seeing just sort of essentially different slopes, but steep inclines up. To give you a sense also a little bit of the numbers here, you're looking at on that, they're in order of kind of highest number of applications today. University of Vermont went from about 8,000 to 30,000 over the last 30 years, and UCLA was 22,650 up to 150,000. So that's kind of the range you're looking at, and we have things here in between. One thing I think that's important to note is if you look at UCLA here, back in 1992, they had 22,650 applications. If you look at the lowest number here on the chart for class of 2022, you'll see that they've got 8,000 applications. I mean, they've got 30,000 applications, excuse me. So UCLA, the lowest number 30 years ago is still, the highest number today is still higher than that. And so you can really see with Michigan, just a couple of the ones that I know people are especially interested in, you've got Michigan going from 18,000 to 84,000. They've nearly doubled in 10 years. And they've gone up 97% since 2012 when they joined the Common App. And that's just staggering. And it's a popular school for our students, and I know for everybody out there. At UC Berkeley and UCLA, on the right side of this chart, you'll see that these schools have doubled in the last 10 years, have essentially doubled. And so it's really, again, a pretty stark contrast. So here's application numbers. What happens when application numbers go up by a lot and the size of the class stays the same? The admit rate goes down. And so now let's take a look at the admit rates. Here you can see, again, same group of schools, by the way. You're seeing admit rates, Michigan going from about 64% down to 19%. You've got UVA 43% down to 18.5%. And you've got Wisconsin 74% down to 49%. And you've got UCLA with an admit rate below 10%. They're at 8.5%. And so again, just really, really stark changes over time. Now, we would expect over 30 years for things to change. Maybe not this much if we were predicting back then, but certainly it's reasonable that things have changed, and we've got kind of grown accustomed to it, that it ticked up little by little each year, but it was an amount that was quite digestible. What's happened in the last 2 years since the pandemic began, and certainly even in the last year, is even more remarkable. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper, not only these last 30 years like I just did, Trish is going to dig into the last 2 years in particular. And to use the same language we did a couple of moments ago, buckle up.
Buckle up indeed. And before we leave this slide, Bari, I'll add too, you mentioned that our data tonight comes from a variety of sources. I think our favorite source was the online version of the 1992 FISC guide that we found. Essentially a scanned version of this old, really thick FISC guide that has been around since way back when. So that was a nice trip down memory lane to read the descriptions of schools and see what had changed and what hadn't. But certainly a lot of changes, as Bari said, in just the last 2 years. So I want to zoom in and look at that a bit more. We shared a chart that had actual numbers for our deep dive back. But I think it's really helpful for these last 2 years to look specifically at the percent change in application numbers, and we'll look at admit rates in a moment. But I want to talk about why we're looking specifically at these last 2 years, right? You'll see here that this information is from the fall 2020 entering class and the fall 2022 entering class. And you might look at fall 2020 and think, well, that's not pre-pandemic, but you need to remember that it is. Right? So students who entered college in the fall of 2020 are students who applied to those colleges from November 2019 through January 2020. And those admissions offices were having conversations about those students from November 2019 to call it February 2020. And in the case of a lot of schools, they had already sent their final decisions out before that time in mid-March, where we all thought we were going to head home for 2 weeks and then get on about our normal lives. So any information you see about that fall entering class of 2020 or the class of 2024 is really what we would call a pre-pandemic class. And so it really is incredible to see how much things have changed in just that time. Why the increases at so many schools? There are a lot of factors. Of course, I'm sure you're all aware that many of these schools were forced into becoming test optional in their admission process when access to testing was very limited. And when they did that, many students who might not have thrown their hat in the ring previously decided to do so, right? A student that might have self-identified as having a little bit of a weaker profile because of their testing might have now said, okay, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to try for Michigan or whatever. And so that, of course, saw application numbers go up, but also because students were really unsure about what the situation would be like in fall 2021, right? So students applying that next year might have been applying to their local flagship institution in their state who had previously wanted to go further away for school, right? And they were making sure that they had an option to stay close to home if their family ultimately decided that was the best choice for them. Other things as well. You see, the smallest increase, which is not small by any stretch of the imagination when you consider it's over just 2 application cycles, is at the University of Florida with 21% increase. But at the other end of that, you have the University of Maryland, which in these last 2 years has seen a 73% increase. It's really important to note that that's not just pandemic factors, right? In the fall of 2021, the University of Maryland actually joined the Common Application. And in that year alone, the difference between the fall 2020 applicant pool and the fall 2021 applicant pool, the University of Maryland had a 56% increase. So the impact of joining the Common Application, the ease of applying to a school through the Common Application, not having to do their own application or potentially create an application account on the coalition application just for one school, already just means that so many students are going to add that school to their list that might not have otherwise. One smaller obstacle. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to think about, because as I'm sure those of you who have been visiting schools over the past couple of years have observed, is that colleges love to talk about their application increases. They love to talk about how many more applications they're getting. It doesn't always tell the full story. So while that does mean largely that things have become more competitive, what it really means is that things have become more unpredictable. And I think that's an important distinction, because just as they've become unpredictable for students, so too have they become unpredictable for admissions offices. Right? When you see an incredible increase in the span of just a year or two, right? Maryland went from 32,000 applications to 56,000 applications. Your applicant pool behaves really differently than it did in all the preceding years when your data could tell you how many students were likely to enroll and what quality of students were likely to enroll. So there's so many things you can't control for when you have these big increases. You can't speak to the quality of that surge, whether those candidates are well qualified or below your typical profile, and certainly can't speak to how those students will yield. And when we're talking about yield, we're talking about the percentage of students who are offered admission who ultimately enroll. And so sometimes these big shifts are just as nerve-wracking for colleges as they are for families, because it's really unclear how many students they should be admitting, where they should be admitting them from, especially in the consideration of public institutions. And we also see a pretty significant trickle-down effect. And this is true in the admissions landscape in general. But you think about places like a Michigan and a University of Virginia becoming more competitive and having more applications. So then you see their peer institutions, or potentially schools that consider them aspirational peers, also seeing increases, like a Wisconsin and a Maryland. And so it just continues to have this impact. I talked about Maryland joining the Common App, so I should mention too that this year, for this fall, applicants applying this fall for next year, is the first time that the University of Texas at Austin is going to be on the Common App, and also the University of Washington. And so we can expect to see some pretty big changes in their pool throughout the course of this application cycle as well. So we don't know how to predict for that, but we'll see. Hopefully this time next year, we'll have a little bit more information about how that has impacted them. So as we saw on Bari's slides about the last few decades, the admit rate tends to go down when the application numbers go up. And sometimes this is because the quality is stronger. It's not always the case. It's important to remember too, for these institutions, that we don't have a breakdown for all of these places as it pertains to in-state and out-of-state candidates. But that is a really important factor to think about. And for almost all of these schools, you might consider that these admit rates dropping is a combination of a lot of factors. Of course, we recognize that there's more applications, and we took a look at that. But this has also been a really odd couple of years for enrollment, right? Schools have maybe in the fall 2020 over-enrolled more than they thought, and then had to pull back on the number of admits they were offering the next year. There's just so many factors at play. Unpredictable yield has been a really big one just these past couple of years, particularly as they're considering out-of-state candidates. Right? How likely is the student really to come from halfway across the country to attend our school when they might have an opportunity closer to home? And so we're seeing more and more schools, even these places that didn't used to do it, really endeavor to protect their yields by being conservative with offers of admission for out-of-state students until those students have really had the opportunity to prove their interest through waitlist activity and things like that. So one thing I do want to point out is you'll notice if you look at Michigan's admit rate over the past 2 years, it's dropped by 26%, a percent change of 26%, but their number of admits has stayed virtually the same, right? In the fall 2020 cycle, they admitted just over 16,500 students, and this past year, just around 16,000 students. So the numbers aren't always changing, but these huge application increases are just impacting things in ways that make the schools seem, not just seem more competitive, but certainly be more competitive.
Yeah.
So,
oh,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry about that. I was going to say, one of the other things also is that with all the things that you're saying, how does this translate for a student? So what am I supposed to do, right? You're telling us there's been this big change over time. There's been this even bigger change in many ways in the last couple of years. So what do I do? How do I figure out, where to apply? And again, before all of this started, it was difficult to differentiate. A lot of kids would be like, I don't know, I'm just going to apply to, these or whichever number of them, or based on just sort of weather or whatever it would be.
Right.
But we're going to get into in the upcoming slides how to think a little bit differently about these schools. But one of the things also about these schools is that historically they've been more straightforward. And by straightforward, I mean, like you kind of could count on them if you were at a certain level or above. You maybe not all of them, but like if you had a few of them, it was kind of like the vibe that parents talk about when we applied, that if you were sort of a certain level of student, you applied to like 5 schools, you knew you would get into one of them. It was sort of like that. And what's really changed in the pandemic, because that held steady, even with all those big application increases and the admit rate dropping over, 28 years, they still remain more straightforward and predictable.
Yeah.
Last year in particular, we just saw such a shift in these schools where clearly many more students were using them as backups and it wasn't coming through, where students who were solidly like right in there, who would have had multiple options, weren't seeing that. And like Trish is saying, a lot of it comes from the unpredictability that the colleges are feeling. But that translates for students in having to have a bit of a broader list this year. And, we've never been proponents of like, kind of just sort of big lists and kind of like unnecessarily lengthy lists. We're still not. But I do think that you have to have a couple of more options, particularly in what you think are the target and the safer zone, because not as many of them are going to be as straightforward as they have been in the past. Of
That's
course,
true.
as more people have longer lists, it makes the problem worse, right? But I think you do want to cover yourself because, of course, if things come back in March and it's not looking in your favor, you can't throw a second round in or a third round in at that point.
And I think too, what it has resulted in for a lot of students, this how deep these pools have become, is that in order to find a place that feels safe, they've had to sort of take a farther fall, if you will, from into a tier of schools that they wouldn't have thought would be where they would need to go to look for a safe school, right? For a lot of students, the places they're thinking of as a likelier option have really become more targety in the last couple of years. And that's been hard for students and families and us to wrap our heads around as we're thinking about how to advise students in building a responsible list that will leave them with, options at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it also underscores even more so how important fit is in your strategy, right? How you're choosing which school to use if you're going to use an early chip, either an early decision or early action, or subsequently an early decision too. How you use that, using it smartly so you're still reaching, but not using it so that you're wasting it with sort of an out of reach school. And also, most students want to try to reach in early, and that's understandable. But also kind of, again, doing it smartly.
Right.
And we're going to take a closer look at some of these things which can help you make those decisions for these particular types of schools. So the closer look that we're going to take are going to be at some of the nuances specific to public institutions, especially as you look at the more general numbers and admit rates. So one of the things is state enrollment mandates. And so you may have heard about this. This is when a certain percentage of the class is reserved for in-state students. This is often, it's set by the state legislature or something, some part of the state government. And it's a very important part of the process because if you see it here, if you're UT Austin or you're interested in UT Austin and you know that 90% of the spots are going to in-state students, then you need to, just calibrate appropriately about where what your chances might be and how that looks. We'll be digging in a little bit more in a couple of slides to the UT Austin numbers, so stay tuned. But here you can see for UT Austin, 90% in-state. In UNC, it's an 82% in-state mandate. At UVA, it's 66%. At Wisconsin, it's not an official mandate, but they commit to a particular number of in-state students, and it amounts to basically 45%. So while not given as a direct mandate like these others, it essentially functions as such. And so there are also state schools, by the way, that don't have enrollment mandates. Vermont is one of them. Georgia is another, though their classes tend to hover pretty consistently at about 75% in-state students. Michigan does not technically have a mandate, but they tend to hover at about 50%. And then Wisconsin, as I mentioned, at about 45%, even though not an official mandate. But this is an important thing, again, as you're looking at general admit rates and numbers in kind of getting a sense of just how many spaces or what proportion of the pie, so to speak, is going to be available to out-of-state students.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even just out of state, but out of region, right? So Wisconsin further has an agreement with Minnesota, and students from Minnesota pay in-state tuition at Wisconsin, and there's a certain number of students from Minnesota coupled with students from Wisconsin that contribute to their overall pool and that have to be in their pool to abide by that agreement. You'll see other states like Vermont, as Bari mentioned, they don't have an official in-state mandate, but you get a sense of what their priorities are, because if you look for what percentage of students come from in-state, they actually report more often on what percentage of students come from New England. So they're not even just serving their own state at a preferential rate, but potentially the region where they are as well. And that's not going to be true for every school, but certainly for some of them. And that has a big impact on the admit rate for students from in-state versus out of state. So we'll take a look at just a couple of schools here. This is not always data that schools will make available. So we've taken a couple snapshots of places where we know students have a lot of interest, but it is really interesting to look at what you might hear reported out versus what you'll find if you're able to dig a little deeper. So you'll see just 2 years ago at the University of Michigan, an overall admit rate of 26% in their pool, but in-state students admitted at a rate of 48%. And by comparison, students from out of state, just 22%. This very, very new information from the University of North Carolina is particularly shocking to me to see that. I think this is the first year that the out-of-state admit rate, at least in the data that I've seen, has dipped below 10%. And that really is incredible. When you start looking at an admit rate of 8%, you're looking at essentially, getting into UNC as an out-of-state student as comparable to being admitted to some of the Ivies or the near Ivies. And that, I think, is really alarming for folks who can't really conceptualize that admission to a public institution would be that competitive. So again, that overall admit rate doesn't tell the whole story. At the University of Florida, I think in recent years, it's been about, excuse me, an overall admit rate of 29%, but 54% from students in state and 22% out of state. So, we have a lot of students who are looking at some of these places that are really high profile for a lot of reasons, as Bari mentioned earlier, sort of the rah-rah sports, and certainly for their academic qualities and credentials. But it can be really, really difficult for students from out of state to gain access to these places. And I'll point out too that just as you're not always going to find a different admit rate posted for in-state and out-of-state students, that's the case for other information you might be looking for as you're trying to determine whether or not a school is a good fit for you or in your academic wheelhouse. It's really rare to find a school that's willing to report a different GPA middle 50% range or SAT or ACT middle 50% range for in-state students and out-of-state students. But we can assume, based on what we know about admit rate, that those things would differ considerably as well. So if you're hearing from a public institution that they have a middle 50% rate for admitted students on the ACT of a 30 to a 33, I think you can make a reasonable assumption that if you're applying from out of state, that range would be a bit higher. And if you're certainly the higher end of that, or the lower end of that range would probably be higher. And then if you're applying from in-state, the bottom end of that range would probably be lower. And so those are some things to think about, because again, you're not often going to find that reported on, but it can be really helpful as you're thinking about what is important to the admissions committee.
And another thing that's important about all this in-state versus out-of-state data, remember that out-of-state also includes international, which
That's
is
right.
for a lot of these schools can be a sizable, proportion of the class, but that's also something to remember, that it's not just, students applying from the 50 states, but internationally as well.
That's right.
All right, well, let's take a look a little bit more closely, because some of the state universities are transparent, and we thank you, Dean Jay at UVA, for that. So we're going to take a little deep dive into their data. So for UVA, this is class of 2026. So also they're very good about reporting data as it comes out and not waiting, a year or two before they release it. And they break it up into in-state, out-of-state. We're also going to look here. You can see University of Virginia has 3 deadlines. They have ED, so early decision, the binding kind, EA, the non-binding early kind, and regular. There's a lot of numbers on this chart. You can look at all of them, but I'm going to go right down to the bottom at the admit rate. And you'll see that, first of all, University of Virginia is a bit unusual in that it is a public institution that offers early decision. So it is not common that public universities offer ED. It is fairly common that they offer EA. And like Trish said earlier, University of Vermont is adding ED this year, and we'll see how that impacts things, but it's not typical. So having this ED round in addition to EA is not common amongst this, certainly amongst its peer group of public institutions. But you can see that if we just even look at the overall admit rate in ED, it goes from 32% in early decision down to 20, down to 13 in regular. And if you look at the in-state versus out-of-state, distinctions that you're seeing here, just there's a pretty significant difference between the in-state and out-of-state admit rates pretty much across the board, a little bit less so certainly in regular decision and really starkly in early action. No doubt that is coming from the fact that it's non-binding. It's coming from the fact that the 3 Ivies in Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, that have restrictive early action policies, they do not restrict students from applying to public institutions with early action options. And so for a high achieving student who wants to have ideally an option or try to have an early action option, UVA is a common place for them to be looking. Michigan is a common place for them to be looking. You shouldn't be surprised if Michigan were to release their data, you would probably see something not so different in terms of spread here. They don't have ED though, by the way, so it may be even more stark, but it really, you can see when you have the more, an even more competitive and larger pool, what's happening with the admit rate for in-state versus out-of-state and just overall. So there's sort of this diminishing returns as you make your way through the application cycle, with ED holding a significant advantage, no matter in-state, out-of-state, generally overall, from early decision relative to regular decision, and even early action relative to regular as well. And so this, I think, is super, super helpful. And again, thank you, Dean Jay, for being so transparent and quick on the data.
Yeah, they're great. I mean, they'll post it as each notification plan happens. So they're a great one to keep an eye on, even if you're not necessarily interested in UVA, but just to see what might be happening, at other schools, to see what they're reporting. And so we're very grateful for that. Bari mentioned a couple slides ago that we'd take a deeper dive into the University of Texas, and we will now, because the way that they enroll their class is really interesting and not completely unique, but it is something they're quite known for. And I think when you look at the data, it really is remarkable. So a number of years ago, just about 25 years ago, Texas started a policy that offered automatic admission to eligible students in the top 10% of their high school class coming from Texas high schools. You'll probably have heard this referred to as the top 10% rule. And at the time, it did offer admission automatically to students who were in the top 10% of their high school class in Texas, admission to one of the UT campuses. Over time, as the population of Texas has grown, as UT Austin has become exceedingly more attractive to out-of-state students as well, they've made some adjustments to that policy. 5 or 6 years ago, it became a top 7% rule, although people still call it the top 10% rule. And in most recent years, including for this upcoming fall, it's a top 6%. So what that means is that if you are a student at a Texas high school and you are in the top 6% of your class, you are automatically offered admission to the University of Texas at Austin. And you see this on the left-hand side of our chart here. So for the entering class last fall, so entering in the fall of 2021, Texas had just over 57,000 applications. 36,000 of those came from students within the state of Texas, and 13,000, almost 14,000 of those students were just admitted right off the bat. No evaluation of the application beyond the fact that they were ranked in the top 6% of their high school. It is really interesting, I think, to then look at the balance of those in-state applicants, the 22,000 students that went through a holistic review, and see how competitive admission was for those students, right? So this is another layer on top of just in-state and out-of-state, but in-state auto-admit, and then in-state over, having to go through a holistic admission review, just about a 10% admit rate there, which is a huge, huge difference. So I think that's kind of interesting to see. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you see out-of-state students who are applying, many of them, 21,000, to the University of Texas at Austin, and just a small percentage being admitted. We look at this overall admit rate of 21%, but that out-of-state admit rate, just like UNC was this year, down at 8%. And I think it's important to really highlight some of these things, because there's a sense that these schools are more accessible than some private institutions that are considered highly selective, or in some cases, I think, as more students from especially the Northeast have been drawn to schools in the South, not understanding that some of those schools are just as selective, if not more selective, as some of the public institutions that have long been on the radar of kids from this area, like a Michigan. And so it's important to highlight that. And the top 10% rule is often looked at as unique to Texas, but there are other states that have similar ways of enrolling their in-state class. And the University of California system comes to mind. There, they have something called eligibility in local context, or what's more commonly called the local guarantee. And there, if you're a student at a public high school in the state of California and you're in the top, and your school participates in this local guarantee, and you're in the top 9% of students graduating from your high school, you are guaranteed a spot at a campus in the UC system. And in my mind, there's a big asterisk on that, because that doesn't mean that you're guaranteed a spot in the campus of your choice in the UC system, but that you are offered a spot at a UC campus. And so for many students, I'm sure that means that they're offered admission to a campus that wouldn't necessarily be desirable to them otherwise. But nevertheless, that is an option that students coming from the state of California have. So another layer. And it gets even more interesting when you start to look at things by program. So Bari's going to talk a bit about that.
Exactly. So one of the most important things to think about if you're interested in some of these public institutions, I would say certainly many, if not most of them, admit by school and or program. So there's the university, and then they'll have, they call it sometimes different things, but the College of Arts and Sciences, the College of Business, the School of Engineering, whatever. Some of them, again, are going to be doing in addition to that, or, by program. So at many schools, they're for CS, for computer science, they're admitting to computer science. Computer science isn't necessarily its own school. It might be usually within engineering, sometimes within arts and sciences, but they're admitting to that program. But your choice of program can make or break, whether or not you're going to get in, and pretty clearly at the outset. We constantly are having conversations with our students interested in these schools, the question of major, the question of how important it is, for most places. And by the way, for all these places too, nobody cares or expects you to have it figured out. Everybody can, not everybody, but anybody can kind of say, I'm not sure, apply to arts and sciences. Like, there's not an expectation that you're going to know. But if you are going to say, and apply to business, or apply to engineering, or apply to CS, the stakes are higher. And it can be really very much the difference between potentially getting in and very easily not, almost predictably not. And so we always encourage people to think of a couple of things. One, yes, what do you want to study if that's kind of something that you're thinking about and you're going to be asked to write about it in some way, shape, or form, no matter what. But how important is that to you? So is it that you need to be studying business somewhere? You would like to study it here, but you can be studying it at any of these few schools that you particularly like. Or is it more important to you to be at that school? So, do you just, is it more important to you to be studying business at Penn State and it has to be business? Or do you want to be at Penn State, ideally studying business, but if not, it's okay. And it's a really, really important thing to think about, because the choice of school or major can really, really impact whether or not what your chances are of getting in, and by a significant amount. This is data that is like incredibly hard to come by major or program. But we dug and dug and dug, and we have some things to report, and we think it's particularly helpful. By the way, nursing 1% at UCLA. Can I just say that for a moment? But let's look at these schools. So the overall admit rate, not surprising, we got that, not that easily, but pretty easily. And then let's look, liberal arts is really, we kind of use that as the catch-all for sort of undecided or majors within, non-impacted majors within the College of Arts and Sciences. So if we look at UCLA, pretty similar, at least overall admit rate, if you're applying into liberal arts, a bit lower for engineering, obviously nursing, a whole other story. For UIUC, which is University of Illinois, that is 45%. If you look at liberal arts, it's actually better than the overall admit rate. But then if you head over to business, you can see that it's significantly lower, and CS, which is one of its crown jewel programs, even lower than that. For CS at UIUC, they announced this year that they no longer will allow people to transfer into CS once there. So the only way in now is if you apply and get in as a first year. This is also an important factor. So when you're making this decision, part of the calculus should be, if you're open to potentially, let's say, not doing CS or not doing business or whatever, when you get there, how easy is it, or how difficult is it, or is it even allowed to do an internal transfer into the school or division or major that you are actually interested in? At some schools and for some programs at UIUC, if we were talking about a different major, it would be a different answer. But for CS, it's a no. For some schools, it's going to be a hard no, especially when you look at a business. Oftentimes, certainly for engineering, it's really hard usually to transfer, though not always impossible. But you've got to look into that, because that also can help you decide how flexible you may or may not want to be if you're on the borderline about being insistent about applying to a particular program or going in generally into arts and sciences. If you look at UVA, another place that has been more transparent, you've got 21% overall, pretty similar for arts and sciences. Engineering actually a little bit higher, which is unusual, very, very unusual. And nursing, again, lower. Purdue, you're seeing also differences in the overall compared to engineering and CS. Purdue, for those of you who don't know, powerhouse and quite focused on STEM and engineering. So competitive overall in those areas. For Michigan, so we've got a 19% admit rate, and then we've got Ross, right? And so many people are interested in Ross. And this is one of the things where information gotten sort of through conversations and through other things as opposed to published data. So Michigan gets about 8,000 applications for Ross. They have 500 spots. Watch out, by the way, for the schools that announce data like that, rates. 8,000 applications, 500 spots. And then everyone does the quick math of 8,000 down to 500. They're doing that intentionally when they say it to make it sound lower. The real question is, how many students do you have to admit to yield that 500 to fill those 500 spots? In Michigan's case, they admit between 800 and 900 students to get the 500 enrolled. And so what you end up having is 8,000 applicants for about 500 spots, admitting between 800 and 900 for an admit rate of about 10% at Ross, compared to basically essentially 20%, let's just say. So nearly half the admit rate at Ross versus at overall. Now, a couple of things to note. Another thing from that conversation where this data comes from, they get about 1,000 applications from in-state for Ross, and they are hoping and moving towards getting a 50-50 split in Ross for in-state, out-of-state. And so as an out-of-state applicant to Ross, that's something to keep in mind, is that there is an institutional sort of push to get more in-state students enrolled in that program. The other thing that's important is Michigan is a bit unusual in that when you apply to Ross, you have to first apply to another division. Most commonly for our students, that's going to be what they call LSA, which is their arts and sciences. You need to be first admitted to LSA or kinesiology or whatever. You need to be admitted to, let's just say, LSA first. And then if you're admitted to LSA and you've also indicated and done the additional work, because there are additional essays and portfolio for Ross, if you've done that, then you move and get bumped to Ross for review. And then you may or may not get into Ross, but you haven't, aside from the time and energy of doing the Ross supplements, you've lost nothing, right? If you say, I'm going to go for Ross, you can't get Ross without getting LSA first. And if Ross doesn't take you, you still got your LSA offer in hand. So from a strategic standpoint, this is entirely different than if you're applying to Wisconsin or Penn State, where you're making that determination at the start, and that's how you're going to be evaluated, and it'll be a yes or a no based on that. And so the Michigan one is a bit unusual in that, again, there's really nothing lost. The Ross supplement is not anything to sneeze at. It will require a fair amount of work and effort, and it's very particular. But as long as you're willing to do it and you feel you can do it well, strategically, no issue there. But at most schools, that's not the case. And then finally, just one of the UCs, this is UC Santa Barbara. You can see very similar admit rates for overall and arts and sciences, and then dipping in engineering. But I would say typically it's business and engineering. And I even think, generally speaking, it's more significant here than you're even seeing here. But business and engineering that are going to give you kind of the biggest headaches and the biggest sort of question marks. You'll also see at certain schools like Texas, like communications is very popular, even at some of the private schools similarly. And then CS, if it's a school that really has the CS and is known for it, almost always impacted if they're admitting again by program or major. But this is, we really can't overstate the importance of knowing how each of your schools does it. And then realistically, given not only what your numbers are, but what your background is and what you're going to bring. So often students say, I want to do business, but really all they mean is I want to make money. And that's how you do it, through business. And so I'm going to study business, or my mom is in business, and so I'm going to do business. But they really have no clue what it's about. And there's not necessarily a lot in the background or the profile. So there's a lot of things that go into kind of gauging your odds in a particular program versus not, but super, super important to consider.
And even as you're asking about it at schools, or even as you're doing that research, it's important to remember that just because a school says it's possible to switch, right? Barry mentioned that the University of Illinois has come out and said for computer science, you can't, right? It's a done deal. You're either in or not as a freshman. But even when schools talk about it being possible to switch, the reality is that it doesn't always mean you can complete your degree in the time that you would want. Especially with something like engineering, where there's a sequence of courses that you have to take from semester one to be on the right track and build that foundation. So this is a place where it's really important to be an educated consumer and really have conversations and ask pointed questions about not only is it possible, but how likely is it to be successful, and how likely is a student to then be able to graduate. And so those are all really important questions to think about. And not to belabor the point about programs, but one final piece that is, I think, again, when we're talking about transparency and how grateful we are for what we have. I mean, Barry mentioned that we're often anecdotally seeing even starker contrasts between computer science, engineering, and liberal arts programs than we did on the last slide, but those are just schools that were willing to publish that data, right? We do have some interesting data from the University of Washington from this year's fall incoming class about their business program and their computer science program, and how in-state and out-of-state students are admitted to those programs. So this fall for business at the University of Washington, 23% of students applying from in-state were admitted, just 15% of students applying from out-of-state. And then in computer science, a really, really big contrast, that 23% admit rate for in-state applicants and just 3% of out-of-state students admitted. And so I think one of the most troubling things about seeing data like this is that we know that this is true, and how many more schools is it true for that we just won't have access to that data? These things as you're having these conversations as a family about how you're going to apply to the best of your ability.
I think that Trish, I don't know. I think that Trish is glitched, so I'm going to take over from there.
There's a note that the University of Florida didn't go score optional, right? When we were talking about admit rates and those percent increases, we were noticing that Florida was the smallest percent increase. Yes, they're one of the few states the Board of Governors did not allow them to go test optional, and so that did likely have an impact on that smaller 21% increase in applications.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions actually that did come in through the Q&A, which I want to just get to before we wrap up. One is, I'll just read it from here. It just says, how does one figure out the admit rates at the various colleges within a school? Like at Penn State, for example, for someone who wants to major in science and possibly go to med school. Many schools like Wisconsin offer a bio degree through 2 different colleges. Hard to know which one to apply to. So this is where experience helps, right? So the data is near impossible to get, certainly within, like across the board. If you're kind of looking at these schools in general and you want to try to look for these things, you may find a little thing here or there. You may be in an information session and get a little nugget here or there. But it really is very, very closely guarded. And we really were surprised because, again, you would somewhat expect that public institutions would just have an obligation, even a formal obligation, a required obligation to report to their constituents, the state constituents, of what's going on. But it just doesn't appear to be the case. So I think it's going to be hard. What we tend to do is we tend to rely on the experience, right, of seeing what past students have, how past students have fared with not only certain profiles numerically, but also the kind of things that they've done, and whether they're submitting scores or not submitting scores. A lot of different factors that come in. So I would encourage you to speak with your counselor and ask for that kind of guidance based on it. But you're absolutely right. There are public schools and private schools where they can have the same major in two different schools, and they're structured differently, and they offer some different classes. Usually you'll find that one's a bit more applied, one's a bit more theoretical. That tends to be the most common sort of spread, but it can be different things. But even when you don't have that added factor, you have the issue of just, the different schools overall being more or less competitive. And as I said, and then Trish as well mentioned, is that we have certainly seen, and we want to share the data as it is with you, but, even the regional issues come up, right? There's like a glut of people from our neck of the woods applying to some of these schools that we've talked about tonight. And so even though we're looking at in-state versus out-of-state, and we're looking at program versus general, there's still the regional issues of like, well, they've got so many kids from around here, they're trying, they don't want to take everybody from, the New York, New England area, whatever, that there's an impact there as well. And so there's so many sort of different things that I think this is one of those times where it's a bit of an art and a science, right, as admissions is overall. And increasingly, it's more an art than it is a science. And so that experience at the different schools and kind of getting a sense of how they each sort of behave to qualified applicants, both overall and then by program, is really the best thing that you can go off of. And I honestly think it's the best thing you can go off of, even when the data is easily available, because the data is the data. And then it's like, okay, how does that apply to me? Or how does that apply to my kid? Because there are low admit rates all the time and kids are getting in, but how do you know if that's a reality for you or if it's a pipe dream? If it's really a pipe dream, then you want to know so that you can focus on something else of a certain level that you want and actually maybe get it, as opposed to just going for something that, while we don't know the outcome to anything, because we're not the ones making the decisions, there are some times where you kind of know. Right. And if it's one of those times, you want to use that to your advantage, that you have that knowledge and say, okay, let me look elsewhere. And we have the same kind of viewpoint about early decision for colleges that just defer everybody, and when they know that they're going to deny them in regular. We would rather students get denied at the outset. It hurts a little bit more. It feels a bit like a bigger slap in the face, but at least it's done. Let me pivot and re-strategize and move on to maximize things. You're happy to hold on if there's a possibility, but if there's really not a possibility, you'd want to know so you can reach higher and do what you need to do to kind of get where you want to get. So, it's really experience-based, and I think it's an important piece regardless of the school or program. Yeah. And then another question we have here is, will Ross accept LSA admits after freshman, sophomore year? I'd have to look it up, honestly, for like if they changed anything, because I don't think I've even looked at it, that particular question more recently. But the last time I looked at it, it was essentially like, this many. They used to do it where it was a fair percentage where they considered, and it wasn't guaranteed. And you had to take that into account too. If you wanted to be at Ross, but you would go into Michigan, there was no guarantee that when you applied for sophomore year that you would be able to get in, and you had to be okay with that. And that's still the case, by the way, at some of these schools that we've talked about tonight. But then they moved to kind of like essentially the entry point is as a first year. I would say whether it's exact that it's just a no, or there's technically a small number, you should go in with the expectation and the understanding you either get in out of high school or you don't. I'm sorry that I don't have the exact number, and whoever asked that question, because it came in anonymously, if you send us a note, I'm happy to look it up and get it to you. Get that.
And we might even consider, Barry, with the information that you shared about how Ross is prioritizing students from Michigan, we'll never know whether this is true, but we might wonder too, if they are taking students in the sophomore or after the freshman year, after the sophomore year, are they using that as an opportunity to fill the class with more students from Michigan, right? Maybe a student who had initially wanted Ross, but their academic profile didn't support admission as a first year candidate, but then they've sort of proved their mettle as a student at Michigan. And so are they going to use that as a way to get more towards that 50% in-state students within the Ross school that they're looking for?
And I actually would say, Trish, that's a great point. The answer is yes. That's exactly what they're doing with those small numbers so that they can get it. They can identify. The other thing at Ross that they do, so as I mentioned earlier, so what happens is they read, LSA reads, they pass along the people who got in to Ross. Of course, LSA is taking the time it needs to read. Ross can't just wait until all the LSA reads are done to start their stuff. They've got to, just like financial aid offices that are reading before they know who got in, Ross is starting to read before they know who actually might get in or not. Then they're matching up the admits from LSA with the people that they would admit. One of the things that they said as well is that, this question of like, well, what if you got sort of like you didn't get in for LSA, but when they did their Ross read, a student got a high score, so Ross read them as a strong admit or as a solid candidate, but LSA didn't. At this point, that it is what it is, but they're looking at that closely too and trying to see in the pool, like, where are the discrepancies? And, a perfect example is if they're going to fill a little bit of the class, who are those students maybe that they had identified previously, who then might show up again, or maybe I don't know if they're inviting, they could potentially send certain, mailings or something to those students, but students who kind of read strong for Ross in the first round, but just didn't, make it in. So these are sort of just things to think about. Those kids who didn't get into LSA are obviously not at Michigan, but kind of looking for things where a high LSA read would indicate something else for later. Because again, if you don't get into LSA, it doesn't matter that Ross read you high. But they're looking at all of these things in the background. And like we said, they're committed in general to that 50-50 split, and they really, really want to get that split in Ross. And so it's very clearly an institutional priority for them. And then let's just see here. Do state schools know or care about the specific high schools, like grading policies, difficulty, et cetera? So the answer is yes and no, right? So there's actually, Trish, I've been talking, I'll let you talk. Why don't you talk a little bit about school profiles and, and then just the idea generally, like, about what they can and cannot get into.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of us, when we were applying to colleges, wouldn't have known that something like a school profile existed, but along with students' transcripts and required recommendations that come from the high schools are sending what they call the school profile along with the materials that are going to schools for each of their applicants. And that profile is going to contain a variety of information. It's different for every school, which is a true joy as an admissions counselor, right? To try and take in all these different profiles and look for the information that you need. But the reality is you are looking at it when you have the opportunity to, as an admissions counselor. You're capturing things there like whether or not AP or IB courses are offered, and if so, how many students are taking advantage of those, what percentage of students from the school are going on to 2 or 4 year colleges after graduation. And so where they need to, they'll have the opportunity to get a sense of the level of competition in the school. Some profiles get into nuance like grade distribution, not many do. But as an admissions counselor, it's part of your responsibility to find that information if you don't have it. And many schools offer a recruiting model that is regional. And so the idea then is that the same person that visits a high school in the fall, that has the opportunity to talk with the counselors at that high school, learns a bit about the school and the environment there. And so then when they're reading the application on a first pass, can use that knowledge to inform the decisions that they're making. But of course, they don't get to every school. And so that profile is an opportunity for them to learn what they might need to fill in some of those gaps as they're thinking about the level of competition that a certain student presents in the pool.
Yeah, and just in general, listen, they can't, even a small private school is not getting into the weeds of like, this teacher's hard, this is the hardest class in school. You know, there's just sort of general sensibilities about what's considered a rigorous class, what's considered good performance. It varies depending what college you're reading from, but they're never going to get into that kind of nuance that you might want them to for your particular school. And that doesn't matter if it's, like I said, a small liberal arts college that's admitting a relatively small number of students, or one of these state universities that are dealing with, you know, upwards of 80 and 100,000 applications. So we're actually at time. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Thank you for asking the questions. I did get, for the person who asked that question about the Ross admits later, I see your email and I will look it up and I will get it to you. So thanks again to everybody. We really appreciate you coming. Our next webinar is in November. It is on transfer admission. We put some information about that in the chat. And so, yeah, join us then. It's at 6:30 on November 9th, and we will have some representatives from transfer admissions joining us for that. So have a great night, everybody. Good luck to everybody working on their essays, and we'll see you next time.